And hello, everyone. Azam asked me to say a few things about myself in the beginning, but that's not really why you're here. That said, I'll briefly state that international music was an important component of my life for a long time. It still is, predominantly as a fan and someone who makes a lot of playlists on Spotify. But I did spend about a decade of my life as an international music journalist and the editor of Global Rhythm, formerly Rhythm Magazine, for about 2.5 years, which is where I was able to really understand that while there are so many diverse forms of music on the planet, that in general, the cultures are all striving toward the same things, which is just community, art, and trying to carve out a life in a very challenging time. And we aren't living in the only challenging time, and Azam and I will get to our current challenging time, but that has been persistent throughout history. And what really drew me into international music was not only the traditional folk forms, but also the intersection of electronica and the folk forms, basically how cultures and artists evolve their traditions. So I was fortunate enough to sort of get into DJing and producing and journalism all at the same time in the Asian electronica scene in New York City around 2000, 2001. I had a residency with Kirsch Kale for almost a year in New York City and got to tour with him and Chebby Sabah and Medieval Pundits and some amazing artists at that time. And around that time, I had heard of a band called Vas that my good friend and DJ partner, Fabian Al-Sultani, was involved with, at least managing and friends with. And then that formed into NIYAZ at some point. But I'm not going to jump ahead too far. First of all, I want Azam to say hello, and then we'll get into some questions. So hello, Azam.
Hi, Derek. Thank you, Gabby, for the wonderful introduction. Also for introducing Derek so well, because when you asked me to have this conversation, originally it was going to be more of an interview, and then I suggested maybe just having a friend, someone I enjoy having conversations with, and Derek was the first person to come to my mind. And I really want to thank you for saying yes, because I appreciate you so much as a human being, and I admire you very much as a writer, and I have a weak spot for writers. So and our history goes way back from the beginning. When we met, neither of us had gray hair. So it goes way back. Thank you for saying yes. And I can't wait to have this conversation with you, and it's going to be documented forever. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, you wear your hair much better than I do. So I do my best with what I have left, which goes the other direction.
I always say my destiny has always been intertwined with bald men. You know? So you can just add yourself to that lineage.
Okay. Well, we'll get to logo, but I want to start off with what I had mentioned before about times of struggle. And right now, in the media, we're seeing women soldiers and Ukrainian babushkas picking up arms to fight against Russia. But realistically, women have had to fight as long as history has been recorded in so many different ways. And I know when I was doing some research, I was working on a project with a friend who had fled Iran in the late 70s. And I was looking back at the photos of the late 60s in Iran. And at that time, it was hard to distinguish between American society and Iranian society. They visually look so similar, the fashions and the trends that people were involved with. But then things changed pretty quickly, it seemed, in Iran. And you were born in Tehran and then you grew up in India. I'd love to start with a little bit of an origin myth here and about some of your experiences growing up and what led you to India first off, and then we can get to Los Angeles a little down the road.
Okay, well, I'll try to keep it brief, but I was born in Iran to a Baha'i mother and Muslim father, and my parents got divorced when I was born, actually when I was 4. And my mother ended up sending me to study in an English boarding school in India. So the bulk of my upbringing took place in India. However, I was going back and forth between India and Iran during the monsoon breaks when the school would shut down for 3 months. And then, of course, we had the revolution. And at that time, a lot of Baha'i families who were outside of Iran just got trapped outside of Iran. It was just dangerous for us to come back, because then you had the persecution of the Baha'is under the new Islamic regime. So I didn't see my mother for about 8 years, and I was alone in India at that time. And it was such a tumultuous time for anybody, regardless of what generation you fell into, whether it was my parents' generation or my generation. So it was just a very, very tumultuous time for us. And also, we have to be mindful that, I grew up in that era of, I grew up with my mom wearing high heel platforms and mini skirts. And, this was just something that we were used to growing up in Iran. But I have a very different view about all those things now as I'm older and sort of examining the world from a larger lens. But then I came to the US in 1985, and then slowly began my sort of exploration into the world of music. That's what I always really wanted to do. I studied Indian classical dance when I was younger, but I was always more drawn to the music aspect of it, because in Indian classical dance, there's always live musicians performing. So I decided to pursue that seriously. And I was 1 or 2 years into college, and I decided to just be a complete anarchist. And I just, issued the whole, like, how can I say, it just felt like it was going to take so long for me to be able to implement the vision that I so clearly had, that I decided to just abandon college and go right to creating music. So I launched my first band, WMI, which you mentioned, and we got our first record deal when I was 22 or 23 years old, I think. So I was very young, and it was a very young project. Even now, I can't bear to listen to that music because it is very young. And it's difficult when your evolution takes place in public,
Well, before we get too far into music, can you just explain, perhaps to some listeners might not know much about the Baha'i faith and why they were persecuted? Can we touch upon that for a moment?
Well, the Baha'i faith is probably the most recent religion. It's, a little over 100 years old. And it's as far as religion goes, I'm not a religious person. I self-identify as a secular humanist, but as far as religions go, I find it the most progressive one, because it's, in order to be a Baha'i, there are just certain tenets that, you have to accept, and all of them are ones I agree with: equality of man and women, the sort of that science and religion must go hand in hand. And even if you are born into a Baha'i family, you are not recognized as a Baha'i. It's only, they promote independent investigation of truth, and it's only when you are a teenager that you can come and say, I would like to make the choice to officially become a Baha'i. So it has many, many progressive ideas. And also, one of the things in the Baha'i faith, which I really respond to, is that in order to become a Baha'i, you also have to accept all religions as being one, that for every age and evolutionary state of mankind, there is a prophet who comes and a messenger, and this is going to change. And what made it such a controversial religion in Iran was that the prophet came and said, I'm not the last. After me, there will be others. So this was in direct conflict with Islam at that time, because Muhammad considered himself a seal in terms of prophets, that there will be no one after me. So this was heresy for Islam. So at that time, after the revolution, very much like the persecution of Jews, of course, not to that scale, but very similar. Even to this day, Baha'is cannot hold certain offices. All my cousins who stayed in Iran, for example, could not be educated formally in schools. They were mostly homeschooled. So there was just a lot of persecution. And there's not a single Baha'i family you would find in Iran who has not had at least one member killed, assassinated, or I had two family members, my aunt and my uncle. My uncle was a very prominent Baha'i, and he was killed in a firing squad with 18 other prominent Baha'is, dragged out of his house at 2 a.m. in front of his small children, and imprisoned and tortured for 2 weeks, and then shot in a firing squad. So every Baha'i family will have such stories. So during this time, it was, the West did not hear so much about it because, you had the Iran-Iraq war happening, and there was just so much going on. So the persecution of the Baha'is within Iran was not something that really came under the spotlight until many, many years later. So it was a difficult time to be Iranian. And that's why when we were in India, all of us who were Baha'is filed for refugee status to countries that were accepting refugees at that time. And the three main were US, Australia, and Canada. And it was just a sort of lottery system. You put your name in, and wherever you went, so it was wherever you got accepted. So it's kind of, in many ways, I say that so much of my life was not a result of my own personal choices. It was just kind of fate deciding for me. But, coming to the US ended up being the best thing for me in terms of my career and my personal life. And with all its flaws, it has been very, very kind to me, this country. I would not have had the musical career I have, even if I lived in Europe. I can say that quite frankly.
And so you land in Los Angeles in the mid 80s, and at some point you pick up the santur. What drew you to that instrument specifically?
Another quite arbitrary event, because, now there are so many amazing Persian classical musicians here who teach. But at that time, there were no teachers, and I had zero interest in becoming a singer. I always wanted to be an instrumentalist. So during that time, I had several friends who were, in the Baha'i community, and one of them, his father, Dr. Manucher Sadeghi, is one of the top virtuoso santur players here in Los Angeles, and he was his father. So we used to go to their house, and I fell in love with the instrument because I love percussion, and it just had everything in it. So I started studying with him very young, and I studied with him for 8 years. And he was the one who actually encouraged me to pursue singing, because when you are learning any musical instrument, Eastern musical instrument, it's the same also in Indian music. You have to learn rhythm, and you have to learn singing, and it's kind of a very sort of all-encompassing approach to learning your instrument. So every time I had to sing certain passages while I was playing a piece, he used to ask me if I ever considered singing, and I said no. And he said, you should consider it. Why don't you take a course in college and try it? Because something happens when you sing. I feel something, and that's something you're born with, and you have it. So I just took a course at Santa Monica College. I went there, took a course in singing, and at the end of the course, the day we all, the last day, the professor asked me to stay behind, and he said, I really think you have potentials, and if you would like to pursue singing seriously, I'm willing to teach you privately here on campus. So I just started studying with him, and then the more I started singing, the less people wanted to hear me play santur. So I kind of, it's another instance in which a path was chosen for me.
What I remember the first time you told me that story, and I was blown away because obviously your voice is just incredible. Why were you so reluctant?
I just never thought about it as a medium through which I wanted to express myself, because you've seen me perform live. I'm not really a performer per se, I'm so introverted, and I mean, I'm not an introverted person. When we are just one-on-one with friends, I'm quite open and boisterous. But on stage, since I'm not a performer, I kind of create this world for myself. It's a bubble, and I'm happy to just be in there by myself. And I want to get lost in the music. I get lost in hearing the instrumentalists, and then even there's a point when I sing where it's almost like a disconnect that happens, where it's, after a point I don't feel that the voice is even coming from within me. It's just kind of all around me, and it makes me very self-conscious when there's an audience there, even to this day, after, you know, performing for so many years. So I just never thought about it as being the ultimate medium through which I would express myself. But once, you know, now after so many years, when I see how many people it has helped, you know, I feel a great sense of responsibility and humility that I possess a quality that is useful to society.
Yeah, I share that introversion with you. I'm very good in social situations, or when I used to teach or DJ, if I controlled the environment, I was okay. But just in general, being around people, I'd much rather be home with my cats. But when you say you're not a performer, you know, I just saw Nick Cave last week again, who was here in Los Angeles. And I mean, he's a performer in the sense that he's going to climb into the stage, he's going to interact, he's going to be there. But you still have a very special type of performance. So when you think about being on stage, what is the ambience that you're trying to create and bring people into?
Well, I think I would make the distinction between an entertainer and a performance, because for me, Nick Cave is very entertaining.
Yes.
I'm more of a sort of Hope Sandoval kind of performer, or Miles Davis. I would be happy to go on stage and have my back in the corner and just sing, you know, because for me, I don't really distinguish so much between creating on stage and creating in a studio. I think very much in a three-dimensional way, where it's more of creating an environment. So I really mesh myself with the musicians on stage, and often I lose track of the fact that I'm fronting a band. And if I think about it too much, I'll get so nervous about it that I won't be able to perform well. But I think when I say I'm not a performer, I'm thinking more of an entertainer. I don't really dance, and there are no sort of theatrics involved. And this is the reason why I love that we have moved more and more into a sort of multimedia presentation of our work, and also this intersection between dance, music, and technology, the usage of technology in the visual sense, because this kind of fits a bit more with my vision of what it is to perform. I believe that when you go to see a show, it should be an experience. You know, we need to just free ourselves from this prison of flesh for just momentarily, and be able to experience something more elevated. So that's kind of how I think of performance. It's not to entertain.
And I remember the show you were working on right before the pandemic. We'll get to that incarnation, but I want to step back. You talked about Vaz briefly, but let's talk about your solo career, because in 2002 you released Portals of Grace. That was just when I was starting at the magazine, so I remember that very well. But you not only did Arabic music, you did Sephardic, Latin, Swedish music, Old French, Galatian music. So, you know, was this part of your upbringing? I know you're not religious, neither am I, but this idea of all religions are one, it sounds like you know, all musical styles merge in that album and your career as well.
Well, there's also a lot of cultural tradition married to religion. And I love ritual, for example. I love rituals. I find them quite fascinating. And when I came to the US, I was listening to KCRW one day and this music came on. And I had that same feeling of the hair on the back of my neck being raised, of when I used to walk in India and I would hear the music coming out from the temples. It just did something to me. I felt something, and I didn't have the language then as a child to articulate what it was. And when this music came on KCRW, I had the exact same feeling. And I called up the station. Remember those days when you'd hear something and you would call in and ask, what are you playing right now?
I do.
Yeah. And I called and they said, oh, it's music of Hildegard von Bingen being performed by the Gothic Voices Choir in London. And I immediately got in my car and I rushed to the record store and I bought the album called A Feather on the Breath of God. And I came home and I dissected this album. It's actually where I taught myself how to sing. If you want to ask me when I fell in love with singing, that would probably be the instance that I fell in love with singing. So I taught myself how to sing 4 or 5 of these actually quite complex pieces, just because I fell in love with them and I wanted to take them with me wherever I went and be able to sing them. And that eventually led me to join an early music choir, Jouissance, in Los Angeles. It was the early music choir. And I remember I did not know how to read music and I faked it. I got in because I auditioned and sang one of Hildegard's pieces, and I got in, and it was 3 or 4 months in that the director gave me a solo to sing. And then he realized I could read the music or sight sing, not read the music. I could read the music, but I couldn't sight sing. And it was during this time that I really started exploring all the early music from this era. And then that opened up a whole new world for me, because then I got taken to Spain and Sephardic music, and I became very interested in sort of this cross section between Middle Eastern music and European music, and then the influence that the Jewish people had in Europe and the arts. And so it all just kind of, it just snowballed, and I followed my fascination. In many ways, I tell people that Portals of Grace, that album, was my thesis. It was my thesis into music, because I spent about 2 years in the Glendale Library every day, just sort of researching music and listening to music, documenting it, and then recording some of it. And then that eventually led to the album. And it threw a lot of people off because it kind of came out of nowhere, that album. So that's really where my interest came. But I will say because you don't know about this, I haven't seen you during this pandemic, so you don't know. But I've been having a lot of health issues, like a lot of people, in the last 2 years, so I ended up doing that really expensive DNA sequencing. And as part of it, they said, we'll do your ethnic sequencing if you want for free, because I paid for the medical one. And I always suspected that I had a very strong Central Asian, because with all my family, particularly my grandfather on my mother's side, even my mother, there's a trace of Asian in them. So I always had this intuition that I have a Central Asian blood. But when that came back, it was so fascinating for me, because now actually everything makes sense of why I'm drawn to these kinds of music. Actually, that album, Portals of Grace, makes sense if you put it next to my genes now, because I'm mostly Central Asian. I am only 1% more Iranian than I am Armenian. I had no idea I have Armenian in me. And I came from India and we moved straight into an Armenian community. From there, after Persian, then it's Armenian, and then Ashkenazi Jewish, Italian, Balkan, and then it goes, and then it gets less and less as we go down, North African and all that. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, this is all the music that Lebanese. So I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, this is all the music I have loved my entire life. It's in my blood, So it's actually, for lack of a better word, it's actually quite a spiritual awakening in many ways for me to see it traced through my blood. I know it's a very long answer to what you said, but everything is interconnected. Everything in life is interconnected.
It's
So
funny.
it's a sort of, sorry,
No,
have you done it? Have you done your DNA sequencing?
I am 99% Eastern European, which is 89% Polish, and then Hungarian and Russian, which I knew, but I didn't realize it was that overwhelming. The other 1% is Ashkenazi Jewish as well, so we have some crossover there. But the interesting thing is I like Russian music and Polish music, besides Warsaw Village Band, who's great. It's very hard for me to get into those. There's some Hungarian music I like, but even it's such a frenetic style that it's so hard for me to listen to. So I don't have that same spiritual connection, I guess, with my ancestors.
Yeah, but in terms of me being a musician, like a singer, and exploring these traditions and these music, it's just fascinating that everything I loved, like I love Tarantella music from Italy. And all of this, it just kind of all made sense. Suddenly all the pieces of this puzzle fit. And it also now, I do these workshops and academic, when we have academic residencies as part of our, performances in universities and colleges. And I talk a lot about this subject. And now I think all I need to do is really put up my DNA sequencing, because I'm always talking about, it's one thing when you sort of spew these, we are all one and unity stuff, but, and I'm not a new age person by any stretch of the imagination, but there is something about it when I think everybody, if they had their DNA sequencing done, it would bring a lot of humility into the picture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as I mentioned in the intro, the crossover between the folk traditions and electronica is really what drew me into international music in a lot of ways. And I'm not a collector at all, but I do hold on to some things. And so prepping for this, I found our 2005 interview. So I still have it. So yeah, I know people, if you're listening on the podcast, you can't see this, but for people on Zoom. So this was from Global Rhythm, and this is the first time we talked, and I met you shortly thereafter at Joe's Pub. But when I asked you about the NIYAZ record, you said that the intent was to make a modern record with substance. That was a big thing for us. We knew that living in America, people are not going to understand the languages we're singing in. So the main thing was to tap into the universality of music. For Carmen Rizzo, the natural tendency is to make it more electronic, while for us, meaning you and Loga, who came from Axiom of Choice, at that time, the natural tendency was to make it more organic. That pull made us find a good balance. I agree. All four NIYAZ records are fantastic, but let's talk a little bit about, what drew you into that project and working with Loga and Carmen.
Well, at that time, as you mentioned, Loga and I met Loga when I was 17 years old. So we've kind of grown up together, and we were part of, you were a New Yorker then, but in that period in the 90s, it was, for me, the most exciting time musically for a global artist. There was something happening then. There was magic. We were gathering at one another's houses. We were playing music together. And there was this kind of hunger to discover something new. We had come from very traditional backgrounds, and there was this angst in all of us because we had been displaced and uprooted, and now we had a new narrative and a new story that we wanted to tell. So we were all searching for this new expression. So Loga went on to start Axiom of Choice. I stole his percussionist and started Voss. And, Loga is, he is one of the most innovative Iranian artists, because he kind of took Iranian classical music and did something with it that no one had done, with Axiom of Choice. So he was doing his thing, and he's a mathematician. That's why he called it Axiom of Choice. And once we decided to dissolve both bands, we had already been talking about doing something together, but it just, we wrote a couple songs together, and then it just sounded too much like a mixture of Axiom of Choice and Voss. And I had always wanted to introduce electronic elements because I've always been fascinated with technology, but I just didn't want to do that sort of typical approach of you have an electronic beat just going mindlessly, and then you slap on a solo of a ethnic instrument or voice. No offense to anybody who does that, but it just didn't speak to me. It lacked soul. So then I was good friends with Arash Khalatbari, another phenomenal musician, Ekova, another great band from 6 Degrees Records. And Arash lived in Paris, and Carmen had produced one of their records with them, or 2 of their albums for them. And Arash said, go meet Carmen. I told him I wanted to do this. And he said, go meet Carmen. So I went to meet Carmen. We hit it off. And, we were all just a bit wary. So Carmen said, let's take a song and see how it goes. And it was just magic. It was just this magic formula. And we just thought it was arbitrary. So we thought, let's try one more. If the same thing happens, then we're onto something. So we did one more, and then it just, we continued. And then with NIYAZ, it was kind of a new spectrum in Iranian music. Suddenly, we just opened up this whole new spectrum. And I give all credit. It's important for me to always say this, because I hate when people talk about being trailblazers and all this without really recognizing the shoulders of giants upon whom we stand. And really, I would credit my venture into this music to the Asian underground scene, particularly the music that was coming out of England at that time. Talvin Singh, all of those, the Anuka album. Coming from India and suddenly hearing this music that I had heard my whole life in this very modern context, but it was a context that was preserving the music and the intent of the music rather than exploiting it. That was quite fascinating for me. And I really wanted to do that with Iranian music and other music that I like Turkish music. So that's kind of really where the birth of NIYAZ happened and it couldn't have happened without Carmen,
And Carmen was there for 3 records, but at some point, the 4th record came out and you were the producer. So at what point did you decide, I'm going to take the reins here, with NIYAZ or otherwise, and really start to focus on your production chops?
Well, I was always the kind of singer that I never just sort of sat in the back and did my own thing, waited for my turn to sing. I always paid attention when I was in studios. And, we're also talking during a time when I never was in a studio with even a female engineer. If there was a woman in the room, she was either an instrumentalist or a singer. So always men were producers, but I love to pay attention. I was really drawn to technology as a tool for, creating innovative art. So I paid attention a lot when Carmen worked. And honestly, I went into the production because I just didn't find anyone who I liked as much as Carmen. When, we parted for so many reasons. I think it just like every other relationship in life, it has an organic beginning, it has an organic middle, and it reached its organic end. And, he didn't want to tour that much, and his kids were getting older. And at that time we were living in Montreal, he was in LA. It just became so difficult. And we tried with several other electronic musicians, but that magic wasn't there. So I just decided to try it myself. And once I dove in, you couldn't stop me anymore. And I didn't care if it was good or bad. And I have a philosophy about electronic music anyway, that there is no such thing as a good or bad electronic music. It's all about taste. Hi-hats are hi-hats, the choice of hi-hat that you put into a track is more significant of your taste, reflective of your taste rather than your skill as a programmer. So it was just following my own taste, and a lot of that taste was influenced by Carmen.
What about other producers? Any female producers or other musicians that you're really inspired by?
I love this Turkish artist. She goes by A Cosmos. She is phenomenal, and she does these solo shows. She's kind of my girl crush. I love her. There are so many to name Imogen Heap, I love. I mean, a lot of them will not fall in the world music, global music, so to speak, in terms of female music producers, but a lot of even Bjork I really admire a lot, and Fever Ray, too many to name. You know, I'll be here forever because, like you, I'm a big music lover.
How about the industry at large? You know, when you were talking a moment ago about the lack of female producers, it reminded me of one of the DJs in our sphere back in the day was DJ Reka. I'm sure she's still going, but she's behind the famous Basement Bhangra parties. And she was talking about, you know, the challenge of going into a new club at all the times was that when you were setting up your rig, there was going to be a guy there to tell you how to set it up. And because he didn't think you knew how, so he would do it. And that mentality persists, and you would think at some time it would die out, but seeing what's happening in America today with some of the laws in, say, Texas or Florida, it's becoming seemingly increasingly hard for women in a lot of ways. So how do you feel culturally about, you know, about, well, let's start with the industry and music. Has there been progression? Have you been happy with the progression of female participation in the music industry?
Absolutely. It's come such a long way since I first started in this business. I mean, I still get elbowed out, you know, when I'm in a space where there's something technical going on. And even if I know what I'm doing, I feel a guy just elbowing me like, here, get out of the way, let me do it. You know, honestly, I'm such a different kind of feminist in that way. I mean, my feminism, I mean, just feminisms is such a nebulous word and world. And mine veers way more towards humanism than it does specifically feminism. Actually, I never let that stop me being, you know, mocked or being treated like I was too dumb because I was a girl, or yeah, I just never, I just had a one-track mind that this is what I want to do. And that's, I just always have kept my focus there. But if I'm to step back now and just examine the industry, yes, there is a long way to go. A lot more progress needs to be made, but I'm quite happy with the direction we're going. And this will only change as long as women like myself continue to take the reins and continue to produce records, continue to just do what we do without, you know, you change by being, and really just by doing it. Now even my male producer friends, almost everyone I know, composers who have known me for a really long time, everybody takes me seriously now. So it just starts within your own little community, and then, you know, it expands. And it's only going to change by more and more women not being afraid to learn, because I think there is also a sense of intimidation involved when it comes to technology. It's such a man's world. So not being afraid to say, you know, I'm going to take this course, I'm going to take that course, and produce, and just start producing.
You know, we're getting some great questions here in the Q&A, so I want to honor those and try to get through them. But just to close my line of questioning, just what are you working on right now? What can we expect from you or NIYAZ in the coming months?
Well, Sinan is here from Germany now. He's now officially a member of the group. He's Kurdish. He used to live in Turkey, but he now lives in Germany. And he's here, and he's been touring with us for many years now. So we have just finished writing all the songs for the new album. So we're recording the new album now. When you come over, we'll give you a sneak peek.
Yes.
And actually, we are working on probably our biggest ever stage production, which is going to take this multimedia project into a whole new stratosphere. So that's kind of what we're going to do. It's most likely going to be 1 to 2 years before the project is completed. So we're kind of parallel creating right now the album and putting a team together for the stage production. So that's kind of what's in the immediate. And we have an amazing team of people around it, which I still can't discuss publicly, but amazing people on the executive end, on the, you know, we have hired an incredible stage director from New York, and the piece itself is going to be, as always with all of NIYAZ's work, it's based on an ancient Persian epic. which we want to bring to the modern stage in a whole new way. So, we've always played with that ancient future.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, from Lady Butterfly has 3 questions. I'm going to combine 2 of them, which is, have you ever thought of writing a memoir? And what books have you read that have helped and inspired you? So we can think of a literature question here.
Oh my goodness, books. I grew up with books. I mean, I went to an English boarding school, so literature was everything for me. I grew up in the library. So, again, I can't name all the books, but I would probably say, if I had to come at it from a literary perspective, I would say more than anything else, more than novels or historical books or anything, I've been most influenced by poetry. And it's perhaps where all my ideals of what most people would consider spiritual, I think my spirituality is really founded in poetry. And it's not just Indian. I grew up, my first poet that whom I fell in love with was Rabindranath Tagore. But then that when he was educated in England. So I have a huge fascination with English literature and writers. So a lot of poets from there. So poetry is actually a huge part of my everyday life. It's, I write poetry, I read poetry every day. So more than anything else, I would have to say poetry is, in terms of a literary sense, is a big part of my life. What was her other question?
Have you
Writing a
considered memoir? Yeah.
Actually, a lot of people have asked me that. Maybe it's something I'll do when I'm older. As I'm aging also, there's this sort of, I'm becoming very impatient with my time, because I feel that it is becoming more and more finite. So, and there's so much I still want to do. If there is time when I'm older to write about it, but there is a director in Toronto, actually, an award-winning director, who has approached me to do a documentary on my life. Something like that I would love to do, because I think, I'm such a visual person. So it would be, that's something that would kind of be less demanding on me, but I think it would be really wonderful. More than any other reason, I would love to do something like that to leave as a legacy for my son.
Now, from Harriton in Utrecht, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, but my wife has family in Utrecht, actually, so I hope to visit. You have been the main vocal inspiration, and wondering, does performing while singing the kinds of songs that you do enhance the transcendence of the language or cultural barriers? Or do you think performing isolates us from really perceiving music and what's going on in the here and now? Interesting question.
That is a very interesting question. I have a very mixed relationship with performing, and it has become even more strange during the past 2 years, during the pandemic, because I've just been mostly in the studio. Well, I've been only in the studio and producing. And I've come to really accept that it's where my happy place is. I'm most happy when I am creating in the studio, because that's where the magic is really happening. You see, there's a moment of inspiration, something comes through you, it's there. And then there's this moment of profound intimacy between you and what you have just expressed. And it often, for me, feels as if it has not come from me. And then there is this investigation that begins to understand what has just happened, what has just come out. And that's the production phase for me. I see it as an investigative phase in music. It's kind of trying to take it all apart and find the essence of what's there. On stage, I don't have this experience. It often fails to take me to that state that I love in a studio. There is one moment in performing that is extremely sacred for me, and it's something I've never really explained to anybody, and most people would probably not even understand it, but it's the moment when I show up at sound check and the performance hall is completely empty, and I stand on the stage and I look out there, and it's it's a moment of intimacy between you and this void, a void that's about to get filled with so many people and their experiences, their history, their pains, their joys, their struggles. It's all going to come together. And there's this moment for me when I tap into something that is not yet there, but it's an anticipation of what's going to come. And that moment becomes very sacred for me. So I approach my sound check, everything else, preparation for that very differently. And it's a strange relationship. When I'm on stage, within the first 5 minutes, I know if I've connected to the audience or not. It's a kind of reciprocity. It's either there or it's not. And if it's not there, you cannot force it, no matter how much you try, no matter how many glasses of wine you drink, no matter like what you do, it's not going to happen. But when it happens, there are tears. There are tears in the audience. There are tears from me. So it's kind of, that's why it becomes very addictive for a lot of musicians, this performing, you know, it's so visceral and it feeds something so primal in us. But I would still say that if I had the choice, the studio would be my happy place.
Now, an anonymous attendee asks, is there an artist or producer you haven't gotten the chance to collaborate with yet, or a genre that you haven't explored that you would like to?
What I'm really interested in now, I've started producing music for several artists, which, you know, it's not official yet, but I'm very much intrigued with the idea of really taking tradition and innovating it, just while preserving this tradition, because I'm still, at the end of the day, really fascinated by cultures and traditions, and particularly folk music, folkloric music, because it's where the story of the people are told. And you know, I think of my music as modern folk music in many ways. So I think it's more a continuation of that, and that can change. You know, there's an amazing artist who I love, and anyway, we can talk about all this stuff later. But yes, I would like to produce other artists who are performing traditional music, but make it more innovative, so to speak.
Well, in alignment with that, Leah, or Lee from Denmark, she fell in love with your music with Portals of Grace. And she loves that you explored medieval resources. So she's wondering if you are considering composing another concept album in the same vein, maybe some more with Hildegard von Bingen.
A lot of people have asked me this over the years. Right now, I don't really have an inclination to create a whole project. I have released several pieces just as solos during the pandemic, also of Hildegard's pieces that I had not recorded for Portals of Grace, pieces that I really loved. Right now, I don't see it happening in the very immediate future, but I'm always open to, I never conceptualize these things. I go wherever the inspiration is. And right now my inspiration is to create this stage production that's going to be, you know, based on this Persian epic. So that's kind of where, and this is going to be years in the making and performing. So this is easily going to take 5 years of my life in terms of seeing it through the production and then performing it around, hopefully around the world.
Andreas wants to know if there's any LA concerts this year coming up.
We are working on something quite big, actually, but I'm not allowed to talk about it yet. Hopefully everything will go well, and I will be able to announce it very soon. Again, during the pandemic, we had booked the Royce Hall, which was, you know, my when I was a teenager, and I used to go, I saw all my favorite concerts there, you know, global music, and that was sort of my, if I make it to Royce Hall stage, I've made it. We had a show booked there, also at the Met in New York, and unfortunately, because of the pandemic, they both got canceled. So if this happens, it's going to be on par with both of those.
Now, James Madigan asks, this is a little more of an aesthetics question, so I'm going to read it in full, and then you can take it where your mind takes you. Could you describe in a little more detail on whether, if one is not to be an entertainer, then it seems to me the nature of ambient electronica takes it to a more sublime level than entertaining? Could it be a deeper concept and idea to explore? The Edge would describe his aesthetic as to take a person to another place when creating soundscapes.
That's a beautiful question. That's actually, those are the live musical experiences that I personally enjoy the most, is when I'm not so distracted by the entertaining aspect of what's happening, you know. That's why I love a lot of live electronic music and ambient music, for this particular reason. And also during our Fourth Light project, our multimedia show, for much of the show, the musicians and myself were pretty much in darkness. So I love this, because then the music speaks, the performance speaks, the visuals are, you know, everything, the art becomes the point of communication. And as opposed to, you know, I'm also able to lose myself in the art. That's what I love about it, is I can lose myself in the art. And the biggest issue I've always had with performing live is I can never lose myself. There's always this part of me that says, oh, you're the front person, you have to make a joke, you have to say something, you know, you have to be present. And I just constantly want to escape with everyone else.
Did you happen to make it to the Massive Attack show the last time they were in Los Angeles?
Yes.
Right. So they come on stage, they don't address the crowd once. There's all this disturbing imagery behind them. They just put their heads down and play the songs. And I would say it was a transcendent experience.
It was such a transcendent, and I'll tell you, I have a very funny story about that show, because I hated where I was sitting. I hated the sound. Which which show are we talking about?
This was the Mezzanine tour. So yeah. It was, yeah.
Yeah. So it was just, I have a funny story about that, because I hated where I was, and I went and I stood somewhere, and I was in such a trance the whole show. And when it finished, when, you know, everyone was like coming out of it, I looked next to me. I had no idea where I was, who I was with. I looked next to me, and Keanu Reeves was next to me. And I was like, whoa, I was standing next to Keanu Reeves the whole time. I had no idea. That's how I just was so transfixed, you know. But those are the shows for me, you know. That's where you just go and you just travel. Yeah.
It was one of the top 10 of my life. It was
absolutely. I would completely agree with you.
Carolyn Reddy wants to know, she says you've been such an inspiration for her own poetry and going for her dreams. So she wants to know what really made you go for your dream in such a courageous way.
Hi, Carolyn. She's my Facebook friend. She's a sweetheart. I love that people think it took courage to do what I did. I just, honestly, when I look back at it, I really had no choice. I was so miserable. I was, you know, it sounds kind of being melodramatic when you say music saved my life, but music really saved my life. I really had nothing brought me joy or happiness. You know, when you go through so much in the early years of your life, it was just so much, you know, being abandoned by parents, growing up in a boarding school, your country is being shifted. I had no connection to this world. And it was really music that made me feel a sense of purpose, that there was more to life than that. And I was just more hungry to discover what that was. So it was really a way of trying to save myself. And I never realized in the process of trying to save myself that I would eventually help so many other people on their journey. But it came from that. And courage is always, it's not the absence of fear. Actually, it's the presence of immense fear, but you act despite your fear.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I'll take it to the last three. Jean Bouchard wants to know if you've performed in Boston or if you have any plans to.
We perform, whenever I announce tour dates, we're inundated with requests. Please come here. I tell everybody the same thing every time. We go where we are invited. That's how this works. So if you want to see NIYAZ, you want to see me, find your local performing arts theaters, presenters, colleges, universities, and get people. Actually, this is how we ended up going to Arizona State the first time. We've now performed there 3 times at the university, but it really happened because fans got a bunch of signatures. They took it to the Performing Arts Center and they said, we want you to bring this group, and we promise that we will come and support the show and you will not lose money. So this is how it's really done. It's such a grassroots way, global music. This is just how it works. It's not, it's so grassroots. So I tell people, if you want to see us, start something, go and get people to create a community. And then we love to go everywhere.
What is your favorite language to perform in?
I think when I just make up words, probably. It's still my favorite because I would say probably make up words. And then second, it would be Turkish. And then third would be Farsi and Urdu, maybe together. But I would say, because, once you begin to sing lyrics, you really become a conduit for the words. So a lot of times when you're writing, you have to sacrifice. You write a melody, and then it doesn't fit the lyrics or the poem. So now you have to change the melody slightly for the lyrics to really make sense and have the right cadence. So there's that part of me that I'm a bit disappointed when I have to compromise the melody. So I think when I don't have to compromise the melody and I just can do whatever I want, that's when I'm the most happy. But I love singing in Turkish. It's such a musical language.
Okay, I've been saving this one. It came in a little earlier, but I'm going to put you on the spot here for the last question. Can you please sing Allahi Allah?
Oh my goodness, you are terrible. Who asked that?
Azam fan. They wouldn't even say their name. It might be Loga typing in.
No, he can do that to me because he knows I don't like singing old songs. At least you didn't say The Hunt. When people say, can you sing The Hunt? I just want to die. Maybe not right now, because I also told the World Music Institute that I wouldn't do any live performing.
Oh.
So, are you bummed? Did you want me to, Derek?
Oh, I always want to hear you sing, but no, that was an actual question. I would ask you to sing Dem, actually. Which is
you and I should actually have this where we talk for like 4 hours because we have such a we share so much passion for so much music. We could probably dedicate 1 hour just talking about Chevy Sabah.
Oh, easily. I have Chevy songs, stories. I have some. Yeah. It's what a beautiful human being.
I know. Are there any? I'm so sorry whoever asked for that question, but I had said I'm not going to perform live, so I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. We'll end with Andreas again. And it's funny, actually. Here's a story, because shortly after we met, I was in what state was that? Alabama. I was lecturing on my first book, which our interview was in, which is called Global Beat Fusion. This is 2005. So 2006, I believe, I was in Alabama, and there was a nor'easter that struck the East Coast. And so I had to delay my flight home for a day. And so I was like, I'll just go see a movie. So I went to see 300.
Oh,
which is
of course you had to mention that.
But the funny thing is, I remember seeing it, and being in college as a Dead Can Dance fan, like my initial is always like, is that Lisa Gerrard? And obviously it wasn't, and it was you. But Andreas wants to know if you're a fan of Lisa Gerrard.
Oh, absolutely. I love Lisa Gerrard. I love Dead Can Dance. Dead Can Dance was a huge influence on me. particularly I would say during the Voss days, and Lisa Gerrard and Dead Can Dance, and also Cocteau Twins, because that's where that whole glossolalia tradition really became a very legitimate form of expression within the context of music. Before them, they're really, I mean, there were some jazz artists that did it, but they kind of took it to a whole new level. So absolutely. And I'm really honored because I went on to actually meet Brendan Perry, and we became friends, and I have made new friends as a result of him, musical friends who I'm now collaborating with. So absolutely, I'm a huge fan of their music, particularly their early works.
Yes. No,
Yes.
not a fan of the movie though. I remember enjoying it.
Oh,
But it's been a while.
300?
Yeah.
Well, you know why I would have mixed feelings about that movie, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was just, I talked about it with Bob Duskus in a recent interview, and I only will really talk about it with friends, not with any other journalists or anything, but it was really the darkest time of my life. And just the death threats and this sort of the mob mentality I faced within the Iranian community, it was just so brutal. I mean, if there was any ounce of nationalistic pride left in me, they beat it to death, because I just saw such a dark side of humanity from working. And all it was a friend of mine, a great composer, and I creating wonderful music for a project that I thought no one is going to take this film seriously. It's a comic book, and it went on to make such a huge political and cultural statement. So, and not a good one. And that, both Tyler and I, the composer of the film, it's sort of, we don't talk about 300 ever when we're together, because we're still very close friends.
I did not know about that aspect of it. I didn't know you received personal, so I wouldn't have brought that up. I thought you just meant the movie, around the movie itself. So I did not realize that.
You didn't know this?
No,
Everybody knew this. Everyone who was close, who knew me at that time. Yes, I had to shut down my email, my websites. I had so many death threats from Iranians for having, and the weird thing is there are multiple like well-known Iranians who worked on that film. And I joke with them to this day. I say, I can blackmail you. So don't ever cross me, because it'll come out that you worked on the movie. But for some reason I became this, I'll never forget that I went to see I always saw the movie in parts when Tyler and I were working on the score. And when I went to the red carpet event, when it came out, I came out, and I remember Loga called me. He was in India at that time. He called me because he owned his art gallery still. And he called me, and he said, how was the premiere? And I said, I'm freaking out, because it's a movie that can be very much misinterpreted by people. And he said, no one is going to take this seriously. It's a comic book. And I said, yeah, you're probably right. I literally woke up the next morning, and Ahmadinejad in Iran gave a press conference and said, this movie 300 that has come out is all this stuff about what an insult to Persian culture and then suddenly all the arrows got pointed at me, because I was the voice of 300, So it was such my mother-in-law was being targeted. It was a really, really dark time in my life. Really dark time.
Well, I'm sorry for ending on that.
You're a bad man.
I know, I'm terrible. No,
but you didn't know. You didn't know. And, people still ask me to this day, if you knew what you knew now, would you still do it? And absolutely, because that score, if you listen to it on its own, it is considered today one of them. There are certain movies and certain scores that sort of are benchmarks, like The Matrix is one of them. Every movie now you see it and you're like, oh, those action sequences are like The Matrix. And 300 score, I mean, every Hollywood studio I would walk into, the composers, that's how they introduced me. She's the singer of 300, and with such pride. So, artistically and musically, I'm really proud of the work that we did. And it's just so, it always comes back. I mean, honestly, I think if that movie came out now, cancel culture would have been in full effect when it came. Well,
that's an entire other conversation, but I do agree about the music. It is beautiful.
Oh,
as
thank
are
you.
you. So thank you, Azam.
Also, you are beautiful. Thank you so much for doing this. And I wish we did one where, actually, let's plan on doing one where I ask you the questions and get you to talk about yourself, because you are such a fascinating, intelligent, and interesting person, such a beautiful human being that I think, do you want to end with telling people something about your writings? Like, you didn't even talk about conspirituality, which you were supposed to. I asked.
No, this is about you, Azam, and I'll
No,
pass
it's
it to
not about
Gabby.
me, because I'm sure people are wondering why Azam wanted to speak with Derek. I'm making you blush, just so you know you're very red.
As
But I
happens,
think
yes.
also your writings, a lot of what you write, the articles you publish are very relevant to even my political and social views. So are you sure you don't want to say anything and refer people to some of your writings?
I will say that for the last 2 years, I've co-hosted and founded a podcast called Conspirituality, which is about the crossover between the left wellness industry and the conspiracy theories that came from the far right, and how they have intersected predominantly in anti-vaxxers, but right now in PSYOP ideas in the war in Ukraine, for example, and how a number of these influencers are monetizing these events in the world to the greater detriment of the good of society, I feel. And we just signed a book deal with Public Affairs and Random House for this podcast. And besides my full-time work, which happens to be in cryptocurrency of all things, I take the podcast very seriously. So that's where most of my energy is devoted. So thank you for asking, Azam.
No, it's so important. Actually, with all due respect, I think just these last few seconds of what you said is by far more important than anything I've said in this entire interview, because we're on the precipice of a very, very I never imagined as humanity we would be where we are now, and it's truly, truly frightening, regardless of where you live on this planet. So I think the work that you're doing is so important. Not that art isn't important, but I think the work you're doing is very important. So thank you for taking a couple minutes to talk about that. And I really, everything, Derek's linked to his books and everything he does is they're going to include it, which I'm very grateful for. And I'm very, very grateful to you again. Thank you for having this discussion. And then you're going to come to my house. I'm going to cook for you and spoil you with Persian love.
I'm fine. I am fine with that. That is all the payment I need is your friendship. So thank you, Azam.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for this great conversation. I mean, two remarkable human beings and artists and people who help us all move forward and make it through, which is testing times. And one of the things that I'm framing from what you have said, Azam, is that music shows that there's more to life. And that is definitely true. And we couldn't, agree with you more. And thank you. We thank everybody for joining us. We wish you a safe and peaceful rest of the day. And we hope you'll join us again at another at-home session. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby.
Thank you. And I didn't thank World Music Institute. I was so busy thanking Derek that I didn't thank you, but I really want to thank World Music Institute for, first of all, inviting us to perform in New York City. And Gabby, you worked so hard to organize this event and while you're juggling so many events. So I really want to thank you for that. And at the end of the day, what you do, what Derek does, what I do, it all matters, because what we do with our lives, what we choose to do with our lives is echoes throughout the universe. So we want to make sure these echoes are positive ones.
Exactly. And
yes,
I have to plug, of course, one more time, April 3rd, New York City, LPR, you'll have the opportunity to see NIYAZ live, and we can't wait to see you there. Goodbye.
yes. Bye.
Bye.